The Pope and Young Club wants to welcome you as we rally together to ensure our bow hunting opportunities for today and tomorrow. You've come to the podcast that believes in preserving, protecting, and promoting the passion for bow hunting. Join us as we strive to be the voice of today's bow hunter. This is the Pope and Young Podcast. All right, everybody, welcome to the Pope and Young Podcast. I am joined back now by Tim Rzuski. Tim had some measuring courses, and I had to do them anyways, and so Tim was left out of the last couple, but I'm excited to have Mr. Tim Bow back. Tim, how'd your measuring courses go, dude?
We've only had one so far.
Yep,
and that was in Utah. Yep, that was great. We're hoping that I'll make Minnesota. We've also got one coming up in West Virginia, Saskatchewan, kind of two in Saskatchewan. And then possibly, there's still a possibility that Boone and Crockett's going to organize one in Oklahoma.
Yeah. Very cool.
But the ones that we host, Utah went great. Minnesota's coming up real fast, and it'll be a good event going with it. That'll be with another bow hunter bash.
How many students did you have in Utah?
We had 24.
Now you had a couple of I don't know if you can call them like star students, but they competed in the field judging championship and just crushed it. Brand new measures going through the course, and what was it, like 3/8 of an inch off on one of them?
What are you talking about, bro? That was me.
Well,
I won the whole thing. I was off.
You had two students.
I was off really 1/8 on two of them. A total fluke, though. True. Yeah, I think they told us that they had 42 entries. I don't know how many of the students, but I think a lot of them participated. And Blake won a place. Tristan won a place. And then Taylor, she took 2 awards. That was really cool. I think everybody up there was either in some way was part of the workshop. So
yeah.
I don't know what it is about the other hunters out there, but they got to step up, man.
Yeah. So we have joining us Tim's new right-hand fella. We've got Blake McPhaul. Now Blake, kind of a cool roundabout story. Blake has been on the podcast before. Obviously he was not on staff at the time, but now he is full-blooded Pope and Young. So Blake, give us an introduction to yourself, man. How did you end up as the records coordinator?
Thanks for having me, Dylan. Like you said, it was kind of a roundabout way after that last podcast. Just kind of stayed in touch with everybody over at Pope and Young. Saw that the records coordinator position was opening up and, applied for it. It was a little bit longer drawn out process than I think anybody expected it to be. But, I've been on since beginning of February now. So going on 3 full months and hit the ground running. It's going well so far.
Yeah, absolutely it is, man. But how is it working with Tim?
Well, I think the trick with working with Tim is to see what the voicemail says and then call back if it's important.
Hey, Tim, Tim, let's just, well, never mind.
It's all lies. I don't talk that much.
Well, I wouldn't say lies. I would say stretching of the truth. I wouldn't call it a lie, though.
We'll go with that.
I've worked in too many industries where they always want more data than you really need. And Blake and yourself and Justin are not the first people to say, can you dumb it down for us?
I don't want to toot your horn too much. Because I don't want to. But I will say this. There are not many people that I know that could do your job and do it as effectively as you do it. And it's because you're so analytically driven. Like, I could never in a million years mess with that many numbers, and I couldn't. And you're a perfectionist on that type of thing, which I am not. I'm like close enough, And so, man, you do a great job. So, Blake, I'm sorry you got to deal with it, but it works, And
I appreciate that, Dylan, and that's probably why you shoot trad bow a lot. You don't want to have to do the math with the pins.
Hey, You're not wrong, dude. You're not wrong. So Blake, you had a pretty big shoot this weekend, man. Tell us about that. How'd that go?
Yeah, so for the archery shop that I own, that I do alongside the records coordinator position, we hosted an ASA state qualifier for Texas. It's a 2-day event. We ended up having just under 120 shooters over 2 days come do that. Um, Went through back and looked at all the other qualifiers and the turnout. This is our first year doing it, and right now we've had the third most of any qualifier this year. So it was a roaring success as far as I'm concerned. Went a lot
Yeah.
better than I expected. Lots of good things. So looking forward to
Now,
doing it again next year.
what made you want to get into the bow shop world?
So I went to school for wildlife management down at A&M Kingsville. I worked on some ranches through college, and after college for a while, managed one for a little while, and then ended up my dad got sick with cancer, so I ended up coming back home to help out with them, and just decided I didn't really well doesn't really work now. At the time, I was like, I don't really want to work for anybody. I want to try and do something myself. I'd always been interested in the archery side of things, been building my own arrows and working on bows and all that stuff for a long time before I opened the shop. Uh, and it just kind of worked out with the timing that I could do that and stay close to home where my dad was. And the rest is kind of history. It's been a journey, but it's growing, and now I've got this job as well. So I'm staying busy, but having fun doing it.
Yeah, and that's so Justin, our executive director, which he's been on several times. Me and Blake were kind of talking equipment, talking different. I don't even remember what we were talking. Maybe it was like 2024 bows of the year or something. And he's like, I want you guys to get on a podcast, every so often, not just one, and just kind of talk about gear, nerd out about archery equipment. And so that's kind of we're going to have Blake on every once in a while. I don't know, if it'll be once a month. I don't know if it'll be once a quarter, and just talk different aspects of archery, different, maybe it's sights or rests or stabilizers, arrow builds, whatever, and just kind of talk equipment. Um, and so we just kind of wanted to, introduce Blake, let everybody get to know Blake and his position, his new role. And that way, as we do these kind of tech talk episodes, people know who Blake is. They recognize him and they know the voice. But before we talk about all of that, Blake, where was your introduction to Pope and Young? And again, I know you've been on before, and I know you've kind of told that in the past, but where did you get introduced to Pope and Young at? How did you get introduced to Pope and Young?
Uh, so growing up, my dad was a measurer for Texas Big Game Awards, so I was always real familiar with the Boone and Crockett scoring system. Um, I decided that I wanted to become a measurer for Boone and Crockett in 2017, I believe. And I'd known about Pope and Young, knew it was the archery. In my mind, it was the archery side of Boone and Crockett. Didn't know a whole lot of details. But when I went to that class, that was the first year they were doing the joint classes where you were getting certified in both clubs at the same time. Um, so real familiar with it from that point on. I don't really see a chance of getting a Boone and Crockett animal, in the near future. Maybe get lucky, but I feel like some of the Pope and Young minimums are a little more attainable for your average guy. So, I mean, that's really how it came around, and just kind of stayed with it and paid attention to it. Been a member for a long time after becoming an OM, and I mean, that's really it. Not a whole lot to it.
I have a
Yeah.
question for you, Blake.
Yes.
So being the new guy, you had to come down and attend not only the workshop and help out at the Bow Hunter Bash, but one thing that I talked to other official measures about on a regular basis, and something that I've really tried to now or eventually do more of, is extended learning, or what they call in the teachers or the state agency world, extended education. And I see stuff come in records. I see efforts being made by measures that I can tell pretty close when they were trained. Just certain things that they do and things that they don't. And my question to you is, having attended and sat there listening to Kyle and I bore all the students to death about how to measure, did you learn anything in that class that maybe you had forgotten, or as a refresher, if another OM sat through something like that, would it be of value?
Oh, I definitely, really enjoyed getting a refresher on all the species that I don't see every day, right?
Right.
Whitetail, which I think surprises a lot of people in the class how complicated whitetail are, just because it's such a common species to be hunted and to be entered. Um, it's weird from an outside perspective seeing how other people that don't see whitetail all the time, how complicated that is for some of them. Whereas for me down in Texas, that's pretty much all we're measuring for the most part. Um, but to your question, I think some form of continuing education would be hugely beneficial for the measures because I know, walking around helping people when they're doing their practice skulls and horns and stuff like that, there was a lot of times when, I'm helping teach the class, but I've got to refresh on the rules at the same time they are. And once you see it again the second time, it's like, okay, yeah, I remember that. But until seeing that, I couldn't remember a lot of the muskox stuff. The moose is always a pain just because it's a little bit up for interpretation to an extent. Uh, Caribou always seems a lot simpler than it should be based off the way they look. But I definitely think helping out and refreshing on that was definitely a huge benefit. On my end, if nothing else, just taking in entries and looking at them more, having that class to refresh my mind and, okay, they probably did this, that's where they had an issue versus, they just don't know how to score it or whatever.
I think a lot of students come out of the workshop. I know we did. Several of us that are still communicating from our workshop back in the days, and you walk away going, okay, some of us had measured a lot before and some haven't. Okay, yeah, I learned some things I didn't know, and I've learned some animals that I may never measure. And then you're a little overwhelmed. And I've always felt that, for myself at least, the class, although it's very in depth and it is essentially 4.5 days, it's still not completely enough time to go over every single little situational rule, say with whitetails. And so knowing that you're a whitetail guy and having been an official measure for 7 to 8 years, seeing that, I just was curious if you two learned something, because we want to do some pieces. You and I have talked about this. We want to do some video pieces where we can use as training materials, for renewals and measuring tips, and just even for the general public. And having someone like Larry Strive come and help me out at class. The guy's taught so many classes he can do it in his sleep. For to have Roy Grace, our chairman, come, or Justin, our boss, who was the guy standing next to me for a lot of the last 3 years teaching the class from the Boone and Crockett side. It's not a fair question to ask them. And so I think people out there that want to become measures and know that this class is a 4 to 5 day class and there's time involved, you will still walk away from there with a lot of knowledge, but with some questions. And um, that's another great reason that we have you on board, so they can call you.
Now, at what point? Because it takes a lot, man, to get not only to become a measurer, but to dive so far. You're so far past that. I mean, you live now constantly in the world of trophies and numbers and inches. Like, how did that begin? Were you just like, "Yeah, I like big animals. Let's go become a measurer," and then you just kind of fell in love with it? Or when did you know, like, yeah, I want to be a measurer. Like, I want to dive deep into this.
Uh, well, like I said, going and helping my dad when he was measuring stuff for a long time, that's really just kind of where it started as something to do with him. Um, Realized that I liked that kind of technical aspect, I guess, of measuring and making sure you're doing it right and correct. And I found over the years that I like teaching people a little bit more than I ever thought I would. Throughout college, even before I was an official measure, for Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young, I was always putting on workshops, through wildlife clubs at school and stuff like that. So I don't know really what set it off, but just being something that I was doing with dad growing up, and it was just always something that was good to know in my mind.
Yeah.
I think there's a few avenues that a lot of people arrive here as official measures. For me, I inherited my grandfather's buck. I've told the story. I went to a show. I was watching a measure, and they all turned and saw my fascination and said, "Come on the other side of the table. Do you want to learn?" And 6, 7 years later, I was finally invited to come to Boone Crockett Pope and Young after applying. Um, some people, it's like in Blake's situation, it's kind of passed down. You saw it happening, and you want to continue that because you too developed a passion. We just saw that in our Utah class. There's 2 students. Dallin Durfee, his father was a longtime measurer, and he finally said, I just realized how important that was in our family's life and how much time we spent with it. He wanted to become a measurer. And Tristan Morris, his dad, is an official measurer still and runs another record book for Oregon and Washington. And he's been measuring with me since he was probably 10. And, he finally has become an official measurer. I think other people come to it from another deal. They get involved in volunteering, maybe at a big event, one of our big shows out Midwest or something, and they start measuring for a state book, and it evolves. They want to become official for Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young. And then I think there are guys, especially nowadays with social media, that look at posts, look at videos, look at stuff being shared online, and they either want to call baloney on something, or 2, they want to know, well, how in the world does that score this? And that usually leads them down to meeting a measure and working with them, and eventually landing up as an application in our hands. Dylan's been too afraid to apply. He doesn't want to come to class and find out his deer are smaller than they really are. But at least he's honest, and he says, hey, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of numbers, and it isn't for everybody. And it's really easy for Dylan to just go, I know that's a Tim thing. That's a Blake thing. You go ask them. I don't.
And maybe it's because I do think that if I become a measurer, I'm going to love measuring, and I'm going to want to do it a lot. And I don't know, it's almost like a thing. I just, at this point, I don't want to get into measuring a lot of animals, but I know once I go down that road, I'm going to want to be promoting hey, bring me your animal. I want to measure it. Hey, let's have a measuring night and just bring your trophies or whatever. And so I know that once I go down that road, it's going to be kind of like a snowball effect. And so I'm just kind of waiting to get to that point,
And it's amazing that the number of applicants that we're getting that are, I'm just going to pick a number out, they're under 40. We have a lot of applicants and a lot of people taking class in the last couple of years that are younger than 40. And it is a little uncommon historically because you have life, you have family, you have kids, you have another career, you are also a youth pastor, and where do you fit it in? I think we also run into that with existing measures. Either they started young, or as they've gotten older, lives have changed. Maybe they've moved, their careers have changed, and they're measuring less. I think we all run into those things that we do as volunteers for the things that we love, that there is a point in time when you have a lot of time for it, and then things change and you don't, or vice versa. So we're waiting for you, Dylan. Whenever that happens, we'll learn you up.
Yeah. I can't wait, man. Now, what do you say, Tim? Why? I mean, we've talked a lot about why it's important to measure to get your trophies entered. But if there's somebody listening and they're a measurer and they haven't put anything in a few years, what do you say to that person?
Well, I'm naturally curious. I want to know why. Are they getting phone calls, emails? Are people pursuing getting things measured and they don't have time? I don't expect every measure to go out and show up to every show and want to measure for 3-4 months straight in a year. I get that. But if there is a reason that they're not measuring right now, let us know. Sometimes we make decisions on who we invite to class based on the fact that we have somebody in that applicant's area already. And if somebody isn't as active as they used to be, we'd like to know that. But I also think, again, our lives change. Maybe our network has now shrunk, or we've measured everything in our network. Sometimes all you have to do is accidentally put a post out there on social media that you're an official measure, and people come out of the woodwork. There's a lot of reasons that people may not be measuring, but it's really easy, I think, to put just a little bit of effort out there to get things to measure. I think there's also some old schools of thought that I try to change the behavior, and that is measuring green scores, or measuring for folks that just want to know a number but that don't want to pay for it. We're volunteers. The organization is a nonprofit organization. I measure every kid's animal at these shows that are little four-horns, and it's cool. They don't even really know why and what the measuring is really for, but they now have a number and something to shoot for, maybe. But when somebody calls me and say, "Hey, I took this really large deer, elk, pronghorn, whatever it is, I want to know what it scores," I always insist that they wait till after the drying period, because one, then it truly is more accurate, and hopefully they've had more time to think about truly putting it in the record books to, honor that animal and honor the hunt. I don't know. There's a lot of, I don't live in Wisconsin. I don't live in West Virginia. I don't know what the pulse is of the record books are measuring out there. I have an idea, but I think just as time goes by, the effort of measuring is just it fades a little bit, maybe. So
yeah, I could see that. Kind of that honeymoon period is over, and it becomes more of a task and a chore rather than doing it because it's fun and you enjoy it. Now, for somebody who has considered being a measure but just don't really know how much time commitment. So if somebody calls, and I know this is a crazy lark, could be 7 hours, could be an hour. But we'll say on average, if somebody calls and says, "Hey, I've got a whitetail," it's we'll say typical 140. It's nothing crazy hard to measure. There's nothing abnormal about it's going to take. We're not talking about the butcher buck here. They get a phone call and they say, "Hey, I got a deer. I want you to measure it." How much time and effort does that measure have to put in to get that measured, get the paperwork submitted, all that stuff?
Every measure is a little bit different. We really don't spend a lot of time in class talking about this. I'd like to do a short reel, or a cast on this as well. But for me, you call me, I ask you a series of questions. What'd you kill? What'd you kill it with? When did you kill it? Has it been drying? When will the 60-day drying period be over? I ask some key questions, so I have a really good picture. And then I often say, "Hey, can you shoot me a picture, text me a picture so I can get an idea?" One, do they really have what they think they have? And two, if it hasn't met these other requirements or things, then we can set a baseline for a time frame. But once we've agreed on a time and a place, and it's usually, "Hey, come to my shop." By the time they walk in, I personally have the paperwork ready to go. I might talk a little bit and listen to their story and BS. So maybe an hour on an average mule deer, blacktail, or elk out here is normal. Some other species might take a little bit longer. If you're at a show, sometimes it's a little bit quicker per measurement because you're often at a desk off to the side and you're not interacting with the hunter necessarily. But I have had shows where I've measured 24 animals in 4 hours. It requires assistance, people riding, people doing a lot of the process for me other than the actual baselines and measuring. I think some measures have a different style. They want to have the animal and do it on their own time. Some want to do it at their home or shop. Some don't mind traveling to somebody's place, especially if there's multiple animals. It really all depends, but most animals, paperwork included, without much interrupting, should take within an hour.
Very cool. Now, obviously, again, that varies tremendously. I mean, if you get a crazy whitetail versus a black bear skull, it can, largely vary. But I was just curious, a lot of people might not realize how big of a commitment it is. They might also think it's a lot bigger of a commitment than they think. So Blake, what was your as you've been through this, and again, you're kind of, further along than everybody else in the measuring world at this point. What would you tell the guy who's considering being a measurer?
Um, Man, I don't know. I mean, kind of like Tim said, it's a big commitment up front. Uh, to travel to the class wherever it happens to be. There's some financial stuff involved. Um, but after that, you can kind of be as involved as you want to be. If you want to be really accessible and get a bunch of animals too, you can do kind of what Tim was saying and make posts, try and volunteer at shows, all that good stuff. But if you just want to have your name on the website and let people come to you, then you may not measure anything for a year or two at a time. So it's something that you've got to be passionate about if you want to be good at it, just like anything else. Um, but I don't know, it's definitely rewarding, I think, because not only are you probably that person's first, if not only point of contact they're going to have with Pope and Young, with the only leading, archery specific conservation organization, which carries some responsibility behind it. But I think if you like what you're doing and you believe in it, it's a great thing to be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the best things to be involved in my opinion. Um, so obviously you're an archery addict. You made your living in building bows, and you just eat, breathe, and live hunting and archery. What would you say kind of what are you most passionate about when it comes to archery equipment? Like, what would you say this is? Arrows, sights, building bows. What's your kind of your specialty there?
I mean, for me personally, and it's hard. That's a hard choice, but I would say probably arrows. Just because that's what I started doing. I think that's most people's first, way they dip their toe into doing your own kind of work on any archery equipment. They get a fletching jig and start building some arrows, and then they start diving down into arrow weight and components and all that good stuff. And that's something that anybody can do at home. You get, I mean, you can get as cheap a fletching jig as you want and some glue and some vanes, and you're set to jet. You don't have to go and buy a press or a vise or all the levels or anything like that. Um, so because of that, I'd say that's probably I don't want to say it's the thing I'm most experienced at because we do all the other stuff too, but I've definitely been doing that a lot longer than anything else because that's kind of the first step, like I said. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I guess that would be it.
To me, it's like, and it's, I don't know, it's the most enjoyable to me. I do agree with you on why, but I also take it a step further, like, because it's something I can just sit down and do, like, easily. I remember, so my dad, he was passionate about knives. Like, that was his thing, dude. I remember, he would just sit and he would be watching TV and you would just hear him sharpening knives. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. I'm kind of that way with arrows. Like, I just love to go out and tinker with arrows, whether it's sharpening broadheads or fletching arrows. But it's something I can just turn the TV on, watch, kind of zone out and fletch some arrows. And for me, it's, if you're tuning a bow, it's work. Like, you got to decide, okay, I'm going to go out and tune it. Like, I'm going to set aside this time to go out there and work on this bow. Whereas, like, with arrow building, it's just, I'm going to sit, I've got a couple hours, I'm going to build, some arrows, or I got 10 minutes, I'm going to sit and build two. Like, it's just so relaxing and so fun to me to build arrows. Um, So where do you stand? And I honestly didn't plan on getting into the tech talk stuff this episode, but we're here. Where do you stand on the whole, heavy arrow? Because we talked about this briefly. Heavy arrows are kind of on the rage right now. But at the same time, there's still a camp that's saying it's completely unnecessary. It's wrong. You're wrong. You're going down a wrong path. Where do you stand on the whole arrow weight, FOC, big debate?
So I've been doing it long enough that I've gone two extremes on both ends of the spectrum. And I think it depends on the situation. If somebody's got the money and got the time, I think that you can build a specific arrow for whatever you're doing. Um, but for your average guy that's going to have one set of arrows, wants to be able to do everything, I'm pretty moderate across the board. My general arrow setup is going to be between 450 to 500 grains, um, usually around 175 up front between components and heads. And I want it to be going between 280 and 290 feet per second. So whatever I got to do to get there is usually what I do. If I just happen to be shooting a super fast, super efficient cam, um, I may go a little heavier because I don't want it to be going too fast. I'm a big fixed blade guy. I'll shoot mechanicals again, just depending on the situation. Um, but I don't like trying to steer a mechanical over 290. It's hard to do. You've got to be perfect on the back end. You've got to have your equipment perfect. It's not very forgiving. It's doable, but it's not the most forgiving in my experience. And conversely, I don't want to be going so slow that if I do want to put a mechanical on, say for bear hunting or, trying to hunt jumpy whitetails, that it's not going to open a mechanical. And I don't want to be getting, you know, ducked on whitetail all the time either. So anywhere in that kind of moderate range across the board is where I like to be.
Yeah, and I
Dumb
think
question. Dumb question.
go ahead.
So I just took from what you said and put it into my own. I didn't realize this. If we had a 600 feet per second bow out there, could they shoot any of the arrow combinations setups that are alive today?
Oh, you mean are there any that they could shoot, or could they shoot any of them?
The first, do we right now have the ability to build an arrow broadhead setup that a 600 feet per second bow could shoot without having issues that he just brought up that I never even thought of? I'm one of those guys that like 450 grains total. It shoots this fast. I don't care what the speed is. I like how it groups, and I know what my effective range is, and I apply it to the game animal as I'm hunting it rather than the equipment to the hunt.
Um, I'm curious to know your answer because I would say yes. I mean, I would say that you could build. I would think that it would take work, and I don't know. Like I couldn't spit it off the top of my head. I couldn't just tell you what it would be, but it would be. I think you could.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think it's possible. I don't think you'd get any benefits from it. I mean, if you say I mean, assuming you have a setup that can actually shoot, 600 feet per second, like you're saying, you're gonna have to build an arrow out of materials and components that are going to make it tough enough to withstand those forces. That is then going to slow it down so much that, you know, in those theoretical numbers, 600 feet per second, you're going to lose so much trying to build something that's tough enough to withstand those forces that you're not going to be up there anymore anyways. It's the same thing as like I had a guy that my buddy Zach was telling me about. He used to shoot 3D shoots with him down in South Texas, and the guy was pulling 80 pounds. It was on I won't say the bow brand, but it was a really widely known bow brand. And he was shooting 30 inches, 80 pounds, and shooting a 340 grain arrow. So essentially what was happening is every single time he was shooting it, he was partially dry firing his bow. The arrow wasn't taking enough force out of the bow to, soften the blow on the limbs, he'd get 100 shots out of a set of limbs, blow his limbs up, go do it again. He went through 3 sets of limbs in 3 months of 3D shoots before he finally realized, hey, I need to heavy this up. Now, on the other side, I've seen it where somebody builds a super heavy arrow and they don't put a strong enough knock, because not all knocks are made evenly, right? Um, and again, they're essentially dry firing it. The knock can't withstand the force of the string pushing on it, splits the knock, splits the arrow, and then, who knows what's going to happen there. Your bow's going to blow up, you're going to blow carbon through your hand, whatever.
So when in all of this did I miss that it was just a marketing thing? And maybe I'm just being a buffoon here, but why are we still talking about, and maybe we're not, it feels like we're still talking about new bows coming out. And we're talking about speed, like, oh, I've gained 5, 10, 20 feet per second.
I could care less about speed.
Don't need it, if we don't need it.
Dude, listen, I've blown through whitetails and hogs and javelinas with a 45-pound recurve going 170 feet per second. So who cares if, and Chrissy, that's my wife, for those of you who don't know, she's blown through whitetails. And I'm not talking, I mean, they were does, but they were 200-plus pound does. And she's blown through them pulling 47 pounds. I mean, so I don't know. Because I remember one time I was talking to a guy and I was like, God, that's awfully slow. And he said, yeah, but how fast is your recurve shooting? And I'm like, 173. And he's like, so why are you worried about mine going, 220? And I'm like, well, that's true. And I might even add 220 more energy effectively than out of a stick bow. But anyways, what I was going to say, Tim, I think, and this goes back to what you were talking about, Blake, because people think heavier arrow makes your bow quieter. We're going to get to a point where, like you said, that nock is not absorbing enough of the energy from that bow to translate that energy into the shaft. And so it's going to get louder because your bow, the energy of that bow is going to go back out. And so the reason that a quietest bow is the most effective is because noise is energy loss. It's transferring energy in the form of sound rather than into the arrow flying down range. So I always look for the quietest bow I can because I know if my bow is quieter, then it's shooting more effectively because it's rather than transferring the sound into energy, rather than transferring the energy into sound, it's transferring it into the arrow and going downrange with the arrow. And so that's what I always look for because I have went up that chart like you're talking about, Blake, and my bow becomes less effective because that nock just can't handle it and it's losing energy out of that nock. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. You hit a point of diminishing returns. That every
100%.
every bow, every setup has a range where it's going to be solid no matter what side of that range you're on. But as soon as you get out of there, it's all downhill. And it may not be much, but the further you go, the worse it's going to get.
Yeah. And that's why, going back, I asked you which side of the fence you're on. And I'm largely on the same opinion of you. I enjoy heavier arrows. I used to in the 2010s, when speed was like everybody was chasing speed. They were shooting 300 grain arrows, cranking their bow to 80 pounds, trying to get, 350. It was stupid. I've been down that path. And I will say I am on the heavier side. I shoot about 550, 5 to 550. And just depending on how the bow's shooting, 5 to 550. So heavier, some guys are like, oh, that's too heavy for me. But other guys would still say, oh, dude, you got to beef that up. That's too light. Because it's not whether you shoot heavy or whether you shoot light. It's when you go to the extreme. Because dudes blow through elk with 350 grain arrows. I've seen it. Dudes blow through elk with 700 grain arrows. I've seen it.
What about when you start talking about thick hides, whether it's big
Hogs.
Bears or hogs, or you're going to go to Africa and start shooting some, stuff that's not blow through.
So my opinion on that is, and it's just like Blake said, I'm going to build a bigger, beefier set of arrows, but I also don't have to worry about pigs ducking the string either. Now I have to worry about them running. They never stop moving, but I don't have to worry about them ducking like I have to worry about a whitetail. So That's my opinion. And I generally, if I shoot a pig or a javelina or something, I'm getting closer than, if you're hunting elk in the mountains. So I would build a bigger, beefier set of arrows if I was doing that specifically. But, and I think Blake could say this comfortably too. I think that's the point of going middle of the road, 550, 450. You can pretty much on anything. It's big and heavy enough to shoot through a pig and kill a pig, but it's also not going to be too slow to shoot a whitetail with.
Yeah,
So
no, I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I agree. I think once you're getting into something specific like that, big hogs, African game, whatever, that's when you do have to lean into a more specific build generally. Whereas, and again, if you're going on a specific hunt like that, you're probably going to take specific equipment, same as anything else. If you're going on a sheep hunt, you're going to take different boots than if you're hunting pronghorn on the prairies. It's the same kind of thing. You take what you need. But for most people that are hunting, whitetails, maybe a mule deer, mid-sized stuff, a general middle of the road setup, if they can only afford to get one set of good arrows, is going to be the way to go.
Yeah.
So that leads me into the obvious question in my mind is for you, Blake. The guy walks into the shop, calls you, I'm coming down, I'm buying a bow, I've got a bow, whatever it is. What percentage of your customers or people that you're talking with have misconceptions about all of these things we've just said? They come in with a full belief
80%.
that they're like, oh, I've got to go heavier, I've got to go lighter, I've got to this, and this. How much of your time is education in the bow shop?
I'd say quite a bit. A lot, and this is where it comes to like YouTube and stuff like that. It's a great resource if you know what to look for, but anybody can put anything out there. And people go on there and they can find a lot of good info, but they'll go on there and they'll go down the wrong rabbit hole. And they come in thinking that whatever they saw or watched is gospel or forums, anything. So I'd say there's quite a bit of time spent, not necessarily re-educating, but trying to figure out how they got to where they got in their thought process. And then I'll kind of walk them in from my side for why I think what I think and show some results because I've spent a lot of time testing these things. I've got not only my experience, but every bit of experience from every person that comes in here and we talk about hunting stories. If I'm getting a hunting story from somebody that hasn't been in here before, I'm going to ask, okay, what bow were you shooting? What broadheads were you shooting? How were your arrows set up? Just to, add to my well of knowledge to pass on to the next guy coming in. But I would say there's a lot of it is not convincing people to think the way I do, but just giving them more perspectives. And generally they're going to come to a little bit different conclusion than what they walked in with.
100%. It's not about convincing somebody, in my opinion. I don't have to, because here's what I tell people all the time. The best arrow setup is the one that you believe in. Like the best arrow setup is the one that you have full faith in. Because if I'm doubting my equipment, then there's an issue. So the best arrow that you could ever build, that you could ever shoot, is the one that you have full faith in. And I was at Total Archery Challenge last weekend with your sales rep for Bear, Jay James. And we were talking about this, heavy arrows, light arrows. And he's like, dude, I will blow through anything you want to shoot with a 350 grain arrow. And I'm like, I mean, you're wrong, but that's your opinion. Like, and because I was like, that's too light. And he's like, well, yours is too heavy. At the end of the day, it's not my job to convince Jay that he needs to shoot something else. Dude's a killer. He's also a world-class shooter. I don't need to convince him of anything. And he doesn't need to convince me of anything. Now, I do think
somebody must have convinced you along the way. It wasn't just you convincing yourself.
Right.
A notion or a theory or an idea started somewhere. And we run into this not just in archery. We run into it all forms of hunting, measuring, life. The internet is a great, cheap, easy way for me to get my opinion out there in video, audio, text, whatever. But I'm the guilty guy that I change my bow out about every 10 years. And I keep thinking, oh, in 10 years, there's going to be 600 feet per second bows and it's going to be all magical. And I'm like, I'm shooting 275 with mine and it's now 11 years old. Why do I need to change what's working?
You don't.
It's all killing stuff the same. It's a want. It's not a need.
Yeah. But I did hear something from Dylan that I'd never heard before. And I want to now get on the internet and look this up. And that's sound. You know, you could be at the range. On league nights years ago, or Broadhead League, everybody'd be down there warming up, and it's almost like they're flexing, you know. The bales are as far as they are. You got 20 to 90. It's not like you're shooting 400 yards here, and these guys got to just, I don't know if they're bringing out the bow they're actually going to shoot at league, but they're bringing out stuff, and they're stretching, and they're doing all this, and they're shooting, and like they want somebody to chime in on how it's going, and then they want to talk about their equipment. And what I found that was funny is that I noticed I couldn't tell speed. I couldn't really see at 80 yards how accurate they were unless I walked down there with them, but I could hear
But
their
you
bows.
could hear them. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And I've had a bow that I thought went off like a firecracker all the time, and I kept wanting to blame equipment for it. And I never thought about weight of arrow. And so it leads to my obvious question. I know I'm roundabout doing this. Can I take off those 80 vibration things off my bow now? If I just change my arrows out, I could take all 80 of those things off.
Well,
I
it
don't
could
know
be
if you could take.
it
Go ahead.
doesn't necessarily mean, you know, and when we're talking energy loss into the arrow, it doesn't necessarily even mean the arrow's bad. If a bow isn't tuned well, it's going to be louder. If a bow, you know, I mean, there could be a number of things, but the point I was making was when a bow is shooting the quietest you can get it to shoot, that means it's shooting as effectively as it can be shooting. Now, and I don't mean like, obviously, if I crank my bow down to 42 pounds, it's going to shoot quieter than it does at 70. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is at 70 pounds, this setup, you know, if I change some things and it starts shooting quieter, that means it's shooting more effectively. That arrow is taking more of the energy and transferring it downrange. Very well could be lighter arrows. I mean, if I try to shoot Chrissy's arrows out of my bow, it's going to sound like it's blowing up because it essentially is dry firing because that arrow is not taking any of the energy. What did you want to say, Blake?
I was just saying, you know, depending on, obviously, I don't know which bow you have, Tim, but you know, that was back, you know, it sounds about like the time frame when you probably bought that bow. Speed was what a lot of people were chasing, but they were getting noise out of it. All that was meaning is that even though their cams were really aggressive and getting a lot of speed into the arrow, they weren't as efficient as they could be. That's why you don't really, I mean, you still see dampeners coming on bows a little bit, but not like you used to. Like in old, you know, the old PSEs where they came with dampeners between the limbs and on the strings, and they came with, you know, built in the riser and stuff like that. You just don't need it as much anymore now. So you may not be gaining a ton of speed with the same arrow on a brand new bow as you have on your current bow, but I would bet it's quieter just because it's a more efficient machine in general.
Yeah. I'm that customer, Blake, that when I walk into your shop, I'm going to go measure
Tell
me
me what
for
I
a
need.
tux. Tell me what I need. Measure me for the tux. Tell me what I need. Show me how to dial. I'll spend 8 hours with you. And when I walk out, I'll see you in 8 years or next year for more arrows. And I do like to tweak with my muzzleloader a lot. I did do a lot of reloading and stuff in my firearm stuff. I do like that attention to detail, but I'm not like I've got friends that have 20 bows and I've got friends that don't let a bow stay in their house for 9 months and they have one bow. And I just see it's kind of like the attention deficit thing and how long can you take as a volunteer to measure? I find that I don't have the patience for the technical aspects of setting up a bow because I know how much I have to shoot in order to maintain my psychological happiness of my setup. And so I want to spend my time doing that. I don't want to change my fletches. I don't want to change my arrow. I'm now mad that the broadheads I was shooting are obsolete. I'm that guy. And so when I come in the shop, I'm going to believe whatever you tell me. And so I sit there and watch a lot of those videos out there. I'm like, this doesn't at all sound like what Dylan was saying or what Blake was saying or whoever else I was getting my info from. And I think we have a, a difficult task as consumers in various aspects of life when we Google right off the bat, we're on YouTube, whatever it is, and how do I know what to believe?
Yeah, and I think that's your confidence in your setup and knowing how you work and how your system works. That's going to put you way ahead of somebody that has no mental strength as far as their set. They want to change stuff to make it better, but they never work on their form. They never work on their shot process. They never work on any of that stuff. Um, I think that, just having that warm fuzzy inside that how you shoot and what you need to do, that's going to make your bow last a lot longer than somebody that, every time they look at a new one, like, oh, that one has a different color. It's going to make me shoot better. I think that that mental dexterity is way underrated as far as somebody getting into a new setup and changing stuff.
I also
I also know
think
that I
when
would
you're
nerd out way too much if I really dove into it too. This way, I've got somebody to blame for all my misses. Dylan set that up. Blake set that up. That's
yeah.
their fault.
I also think um that confidence in your bow comes down to knowledge about your setup. And like, I've been on hunts with guys and they know their setup. They shoot a lighter arrow, and if a deer's at 60 yards, then they'll launch it. Whereas I wouldn't. Just because of the setup. I know my setup. It's not even necessarily shooting abilities. Let's take that off the table for a minute. Let's think about specific setups. And there's guys where their setups are built to shoot 60 yards, and then their setups and then their setup you put in another situation, and I'm like, well, the deer's at 12 yards, but I got to shoot through some grass and garbage to get there. I know that my arrow, being a heavier arrow with a cut on contact broadhead, not a fixed blade, I can shoot through that stuff and hit the deer. Now we're not talking bushes, we're not talking a tree trunk, but we're talking some grass. You see the hunting public guys do it, and they shoot through some grass to hit the deer. I know my setup, and I've practiced that shot, and I know that I can do that. So confidence in your setup also comes down to that knowledge about the limitations of your setup. Which is, again, I think what makes people successful, and this is why I shoot this arrow. That's what makes them hang their hat on that. And not to get it too far into it, because I'm going to leave this for next episode. We'll talk broadheads next Tech Talk episode. Because I do think, Tim, that you talked about the heavy, hard-hitting hide animals. I change broadheads more than I change arrow setups for those. I might change a broadhead because of a specific hunt before I ever consider changing my arrow setup for that specific hunt. I might shoot the same arrow at a whitetail with a big old mechanical on it, and then take that arrow setup, unscrew it, and I want to put on a single bevel for a hog hunt. So I look at broadhead setups before on specific animal hunts before I look at arrow setups. But we'll save broadheads for next episode, because that's a whole nother rabbit hole that Blake looks like he's not ready to go down right now.
No, I was just gonna say I do the same thing, and part of it is I I like getting a bow set up. I'm one of those guys, Tim, that gets a new bow every year. I justify it by saying, how can I sell this year's bow if I didn't even upgrade from last year's bow?
I wouldn't
Um,
trust you if you had a 10-year-old bow like me.
but that's how I justify it to my wife Haley, at least. But to your point, Dylan, about changing broadheads for a hunt versus a whole arrow, I'm the same way. I like to tinker with the new bow for the year. I like to get it set up, but once I get it right, I leave it alone. I build a set of arrows that in general is going to be good for anything I think I'm going to do that year and then some, and then I change the broadheads out. I don't
Yeah.
like sighting in because I don't like shooting at dots. Dots is boring. So I shoot at dots to sight in. I take 2 or 3 days to do that, do it right, and then I hardly ever shoot at dots again until I change broadheads just to make sure everything stayed the same. They didn't throw my tune off. Um, but the arrows and the speed and the sight tape, I generally leave that alone and just shoot at 3Ds and get either real world practice, going for kill shots on 3Ds, or I'm shooting for score at 3D tournaments. But
Yeah.
I'm not changing arrows all the time if I don't have to. Um, just because I like helping people sight in. I hate sighting in myself. It's boring, and I don't want to do it.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more, dude. I have, and I've talked about my target range in the backyard before. I've got, I think, like 17 3D targets because I just love shooting 3Ds.
Those are
And
rookie
I've,
numbers. You got to pump those numbers up.
well, we don't all, but anyways, and then I've got one block target with a dot on it, and that's, that literally gets shot once a year. It's a
Hmm.
sight in a bow, and then it never gets shot again, and it just sits there because it's boring. But so yeah, I'm in the same camp with you for sure on that. Tim, how do they register to become a measurer? How do they get on the list to get into a measurer course?
Write this number down. It's Blake's personal number.
Yes.
Go on to the pope-young.org website, click on records, click on find a measurer, and there is a drop down menu or button that says learn how to apply. When you open that up, you put your information in there and hit submit, and then we get an email. We put you on a list, and often it could be a year or two wait before you roll up on our top of our sheet to get an invite. We do go through the invitations and look for certain things. We still do a little bit of geographical filtering. We try to make sure that we reach out to references. We look for OMs that are kind of in that area to see if somebody knows who the new applicant is. But at the end of the day, if we don't fish, if we haven't figured out a problem in the application, we'll figure it out pretty quickly in class. And then, you just wait for an invitation. Ironically, though, for these last two workshops, both Utah that's over and Minnesota that's coming up, it was very difficult to get any of 198 applicants that we had to commit. I think the hardest thing that people have is they have an interest, and then maybe months or years go by and we reach out and say, hey, do you want to go? There is money involved. It's over $400 to attend the class. You have to travel, you have to stay at a hotel, and pay for it. Obviously, we get you discounts. We pay for a couple of your meals, and you're in class for 3 full days and 2 half days. And it can't be any shorter than that. And you have to be there the whole time. Timing is always the biggest issue. I try to reach out 3 months in advance, 3 to 4, if possible. And for most people, it's too far away and it's never going to get any closer, likely. Or 2, that week doesn't work for me. And so getting on the list tomorrow, you could get a phone call for a workshop in the winter. It could happen.
Yeah. So guys, I would highly encourage you, if you've thought about it, go ahead and get on the list. That way, if it is way down the road, you're already on the list. Couple things. May 18th is that bash in Alexandria, Minnesota. So go get registered for that. Go to pope-young.org. In the banner header images of our website, this is the quickest way to find it. Click on the Alexandria, Minnesota event and get registered. It's going to be a super fun event. It's in collaboration with our friends at Dialed Archery. Mr. Scott Backen, who's one of the owners, is also our second vice president. So at the Alexandria Shooting Park, we're gonna have a day full of fun. There's skeet shooting. It's in collaboration with the Dialed Archery Customer Service Appreciation Day. So it's gonna be a day full of fun. So I would highly encourage you to get registered for that event. Also, our Deer Slam raffle is still going on. So if you haven't gotten your tickets for the Deer Slam raffle, make sure and go get those. Basically what it is, the first person that gets drawn, we're going to ask them, or they've already told us, what animals have you taken? So if they've taken a whitetail and a mule deer, then they get to hunt the other 3 species. And we will then draw 2 more winners for the ones that they have said I've already harvested. So there could be up to 4 additional winners. So it's going to be cool. And if you haven't killed any deer and you get drawn, you're going on 5 hunts in 2 years. It's going to be incredible. So go get entered to win that. All the money is going directly to support Pope and Young and bow hunting conservation. So again, go to pope-young.org, click on the store button at the top, and you can get your tickets for the Deer Slam raffle that way. But this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest raffles we've ever done, giving away 5 hunts and a gun. So go to pope-young.org, click the store, and get your tickets for that. Guys, thank you for listening. Y'all have a fantastic week, and make sure and get registered for the event and go get your tickets for the Deer Slam.